media's power come from? And essentially, this is where we tie into our discussion of public opinion. Because the media's power comes largely from its ability to focus public attention on some things and not others, and then on the things that the public is focused on, how to make sense of what that information means. And these two things in media studies are known as agenda setting and framing. So let me talk about agenda setting first, which is how the media sets public opinion. This idea that the public, again, internally generates its opinions based upon what it's being asked by pollsters is erroneous. We know that most Americans don't know a great deal about politics, and as a result, when they're asked about politics, their answers are not something they internally create, but rather it's a reflection of the information they're consuming. And generally speaking, with agenda setting, it's that information that is the freshest that's regurgitated back to public opinion pollsters. So in an election, the repetition of certain ideas, this is what makes campaigns effective, repeating very simple ideas over and over and over again. 2016, drain the swamp, crooked Hillary. I mean, Donald Trump was laser focused on those two concepts throughout the general election campaign. And as a result, he was able to really get the public to focus on Hillary Clinton in a very negative way, as well as focus on the Washington, D.C. political system with him as an outsider as being something swampy and dirty that he alone, as he said, could fix. And so we know from public opinion polls and even from exit polls, when people said they voted for Donald Trump and asked why they did, their answers were they didn't want a crook in the White House, and you needed somebody outside of politics to clean it all up. And that comes from that repetition of those very clear messages that Donald Trump's campaign wish he had back in 2020, but he's been unable to be laser focused on anything other than his own personal grievances, and for some reason Hunter Biden, which most Americans don't really care about. So agenda setting is really the foundation of public opinion, where people are getting their information. This is one of the reasons why the public is so polarized, because Americans now get their information more and more not from that legacy media, the networks or local newspapers, but rather the partisan outlets, cable news, MSNBC on the left, Fox News on the right, not to mention the social media system they create, where people follow like-minded individuals. And when you follow like-minded individuals, you create an information ecosystem that doesn't challenge any of your preconceived notions, but rather accelerates and encourages the beliefs that you have, even if those beliefs are wrong, which then pushes Americans to the polls rather than to the center of our politics. So our information system is a good reason why polarization is as bad as it is. And so the media does this again by focusing on certain issues and by putting those issues in a place where Americans see them prominently and know that they're important. The top of the local news hour or half hour, for example, the first 10 minutes of the 30-minute local television news, that's the most important piece of real estate for people watching at home who really want to know what happened today. They're going to tune in the first 2 minutes. The rest of it, maybe not, but the first 2 minutes in particular, because that's where they're going to get all of the important local, national, and international information. The front page above the fold of a newspaper is the most important piece of real estate. That is the newspaper telling the public this is what's so important going on right now. Not to mention the big, bold headlines or the top of a news feed. What's curated at the top is what everybody in your media ecosystem is responding to. And when you go on Twitter, for example, you can see that aggregation of the tweets that are getting the most attention that's designed to draw you into those conversations. So that's agenda setting, because what you're not getting is anything that's not covered. Again, the idea that the media's focus on the things that it says is important, by definition, means anything not being covered is not important. And the public won't recognize it as important. And again, if you're a candidate, it's going to hurt you a great deal if the issues that you really want to run on are the issues that are not being covered in the media system. So you have to devote a lot of resources to try to get the media to cover the things that you feel are important. And if you can't, you're not really going to move public opinion one way or the next. And let me give you an example just how powerful agenda setting is and getting the public to think of things as important in a way that distorts reality. And that example is crime. Americans consistently, in every poll you see, and this goes all the way back to the early 1990s. In fact, it's one of the reasons why the Congress and Bill Clinton in the mid-1990s signed what was known as the crime bill. That's getting a lot of attention right now in the 2020 election, given that Joe Biden was in part behind pushing this crime bill, which was an omnibus bill that imposed draconian sentences on low-level offenders as a way to appease what was the public perception at the time that crime in the United States was out of control. And so for the better part of 30 years, Americans have believed that crime, in some cases, is the most important problem facing Americans. Now, of course, right now, the pandemic has bumped crime off of the map, or at least bumped it off of its top place. But once the pandemic subsides, once we get control of it, which we eventually will, crime will, again, I'm sure, percolate back up to the top. And in fact, the looting and the rioting over the summer, Donald Trump in part tried to make that connection to the bigger macro picture of crime because Donald Trump has run on the law and order presidency, again, playing to what consistently shows up prominently in public opinion polls. And in fact, Donald Trump has said back in 2017, he had a meeting of sheriffs at the White House in which he told them, maybe you don't know this, he said, but crime in the United States is out of control. And that's the reason, in part, that I was elected. And so the question is crime really out of control? Do we know whether crime is bad today? Is it bad today and worse than it was 20 years ago? And the fact of the matter is we do know these two things. So let me talk a little bit about this. So the United States government, the Department of Justice, collects and has so for the last almost 50 years, statistics from law enforcement all across the United States. So every law enforcement agency down to the local constable has to file their crime statistics for each week, month, year to the Department of Justice. And the Department of Justice collects this in what's called an abstract of statistical information on crime. So we have, and you can find this on the Department of Justice's website, we have a clear picture and know exactly what crime looks like in the United States. And so the light green line here, this is from the Department of Justice's statistics on violent crime in the United States. And as you can see here, in the mid-1990s, or in the early 1990s, it's up at the 80% level. And then from each year thereafter, crime gets lower and lower and lower and lower. And in fact, it's still incredibly low. And yet, look at this darker green line. As you can see there, this is the percentage of Americans in polls that say crime in the United States is getting worse rather than better. And so at the same time, in the last 20 years that crime is going down, look what happens. Americans believe that crime is actually worse today than it was 20 years ago. And in fact, when you go home for the end of break at Thanksgiving dinner, ask grandma and grandpa, is crime worse today than it was 20 years ago? Is crime worse today than it was 30 years ago? Ask your friends and neighbors, is crime worse today than it was 20 years ago? Most of them, again, unless they do this for a living, most of them will tell you, yes, crime is much worse today than it was 20 years ago. My parents, for instance, my mom tells me that she wants to go and buy a home security system. And I ask her why, and she says, well, I want to make sure that we help protect ourselves from crime. Now, my parents have lived in the same house for over 50 years, almost 60 years. And in that 60 years, they've never been robbed. The house has never been broken into. The neighbors' houses have never been robbed or broken into. Our community that I grew up in, that my parents still live in, has very little crime. And yet my mom believes that crime is actually worse now, today, than it's ever been. And the reality is that's just not the case. And so think about it in terms of what this means just for revenue, what Americans are spending money on and what our government is spending money on. So Americans, for instance, spend billions of dollars in the home security industry, wiring up their houses with camera, alarms. They move into what you've seen in the suburbs, these gated communities, to provide an extra measure of security to keep outsiders in your community from coming inside because you don't want any crime whatsoever. So trillions of dollars just in disposable income being spent to help make us secure when in fact we're more secure now than we've ever been. And then what government's spending money on? Government during this period of time has spent money putting more cops on the beat. Government has spent more money building prisons. Government has spent more money federalizing all kinds of state level crimes so that you can max out the punishments at the same time when crime in the United States is getting better. Now, where is this all coming from? This comes from each and every night, the first 10 minutes of local news, as I mentioned. What's the number one story? Crime, murder, stabbings, carjackings, looting, rioting. Those every night are the first stories in that top 10 segment of the news programming. And when Americans are told each and every night by their local television news, crime is happening here, crime is happening there, all in your particular area, it's going to affect your perception. Now, you might say, well, what is television supposed to do? Stop reporting crime? No, that would be a irresponsible thing to do. But what television could do, what all the media could do in reporting these kinds of stories, is to provide context. See, what happens is the crime stories are stripped from any kind of context. So what you get is the who, the victim and the perpetrator, the what, the kind of crime, the where, uptown, on campus, the when, early morning, late at night. What you don't get is the why or how prolific the crime is for this particular community. So you don't know, for instance, that a beating that happened on a street corner in uptown Oxford, is that a outlier or is that typical for a street corner in uptown Oxford? It would leave the viewer with a very different perception if you learn that there was a beating occurred And the last time that anything like this occurred was 50 years ago. So if the viewer knows that it happened, but it's so isolated, their level of concern is going to drop. Yes, it's concerning that in their neighborhood a crime was committed, but relatively speaking, these things are so rare, we shouldn't really worry about them. And if you did that, we could be diverting trillions of dollars every year to things that actually would benefit our communities and would help our government, just in paying down the debt, for instance. And this all comes from the media, the agenda setting power of the media to focus repetitively on certain kinds of issues over and over and over again drives that level of interest and concern up front in the minds of most Americans without having any kind of context by which to evaluate them in. The second thing we're going to talk about is what's called framing, and that's how to make sense of or make connections to the information that people are getting.